This is Writers' Voices with Monica and Caroline. I'm your host, Monica Hadley, and with me is my co-host and mother, Caroline Kilborn.
And hello, everyone. Solar powered, lots of sun.
Yeah, we're having such a great summer here. Have you ever seen a summer like
no,
like
I
this
haven't.
in Iowa?
I
If
haven't.
you happen to be listening to this as a rebroadcast at some future day, we're talking about the summer of 2013.
It's been wonderful.
It has been wonderful. And we have a wonderful guest with us today.
Oh, we do. Oh,
Yeah.
very, very interesting.
Yeah. Mom, you want
Extremely
to introduce our guest?
Yes, Dr. Norman E. Rosenthal, M.D., is a clinical professor of psychiatry at Georgetown Medical School. He conducted research at the National Institute of Mental Health as a research fellow, researcher, and senior researcher for more than 20 years, and was the first psychiatrist who described and diagnosed seasonal affective disorder, SAD, which is widely believed now, of course.
Absolutely.
Rosenthal is a highly cited researcher and the author of more than 200 scholarly articles as well as books for the general public. And today, our book is
The Gift of Adversity, the Unexpected Benefits of Life's Difficulties, Setbacks, and Imperfections.
And the way this book is laid out is very interesting. It's very easy to read and extremely. I really enjoyed it. I did.
Welcome back to Writers' Voices, Dr. Rosenthal.
Oh, it's so great to be here.
So the last time you were with us, we were talking about Transcendence, which was that the book one previous to this one, or have there been any in between?
The Transcendence really paved the way to the gift of adversity.
Was Transcendence, it wasn't the first book you wrote for a kind of mass audience, was it?
No, it was book number 6, I believe, and this is number 7.
Wow. And are you getting better with each one?
You know, I think like everything else with practice, you get better. Better at knowing what to write and what not to write.
Uh-huh.
Well, tell us about what led to writing The Gift of Adversity.
Well, I had a whole lot of stories that I have acquired along life's journey, as I suppose many of us do. But as a psychiatrist, you know, I'm always listening to people's stories and thinking, well, what can we learn from this? How can we use this information going forward? So these stories have all had lessons attached to them. And I thought I would lay them out and have a look at them. And a very surprising fact jumped out, and that was that I learned the most when things went wrong. Not when I got prizes or I won contests or this or that, but when there was a problem. And that somehow is when we learn the most. And it turned out, it occurred to me that this is really a general principle, that adversity, we avoid it and we should avoid it. You know, it's unpleasant, it can be disabling, it can be fatal. However, as Nietzsche said, what doesn't kill us makes us stronger.
Yes, I've heard that so many times.
Correct. That
Yeah.
we can learn from adversity. So that became the organizing theme with which I looked at these stories, that it occurred to me that it was a gift. And then I went on to think, wouldn't it be wonderful to share that message with people who are suffering, people who are hurting, not to diminish their suffering in any way or to deny it or make light of it, but just to say, you know, maybe not today, but someday, something good might come out of this.
Well, something good has come out of it, and it's this book.
When I'm in the middle of something challenging, in the back of my mind, I'm always thinking, this is going to make a great story someday.
That's true. That is really accurate. And I hope some of these stories fall into that category.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And you know, you say it, you talk of adversity as a gift, but I think I'd go even further. I think in some sense it's a necessity that as human beings, we actually aren't happy without some adversity in our lives. Now, I could be wrong. There might be people who have completely smooth and happy lives, but I've also seen people who create adversity if they don't have enough because they need the lessons from it.
Well, I think we need challenges.
Yeah.
So I think of that little children's book of the little engine that could. When it's going up that hill is difficult, and it's not sure that it can make it to the top. But it says, I think I can, as it struggles. And then the growing conviction that, yes, I can do it. I thought I could, and I did. And so I think it's those hills and those challenges that are necessary to make us more resilient and more roadworthy, quite frankly.
And also, without those challenges, life can get a little boring.
That's right. And that's why one of the kinds of adversities that I mention is the quest for excellence, where we set very high standards for ourselves, standards we don't even know we can meet. We don't know we can do it. We think we can, like the engine. We think we can, but we don't know we can. And we don't know what's going to come up along the way and what obstacles we're going to encounter. And so those are things that I write about in the chapter called The Quest for Excellence. And my wife would always say to me, why do you have to make life difficult for yourself?
Exactly.
Why do you have to write another book? Haven't you written enough books? And I say, it's my nature to put the goalposts a little bit forward and say, maybe I can just reach out and do something a little different. In this book, The Gift of Adversity, I've done something different. I've shared a great deal more about my own personal life, and I've told it in a narrative form, and I've really minimized the science, which is a deliberate action because I've written about tons of science. But whenever I've asked people, what do you like the most about my books, they always say the stories, especially the ones where you share your own stories. So I thought, okay, that's what people want. Let me give that to them. But in the process, it's been an active choice to reveal quite a lot about myself and also to deviate from a form that has been served me well, which is a lot of facts and a lot of science, like transcendence, for example, and go more into a narrative. So it's been a challenge, but it's been very exciting, and I hope it will be rewarding to the reader.
Now, as a scientist, are you likely to get any flack about doing that from the scientific community? Is there sort of a prejudice towards sticking with the facts and staying away from the personal?
Well, I think a writer is always going to get flack, especially if what they say has merit. If I wrote a book about 10 ways to make waffles, nobody would probably object because it wouldn't, tread on anybody's toes. But if I'm going to write, I can imagine, getting a lot of flack from a lot of people. But if you're worried about flack, then you mustn't be a writer, because that really is an occupational hazard.
Yeah, that's true. Now, The Gift of Adversity, in a sense, and you kind of alluded to this, it really is almost a memoir.
It has that component, but, being a healer, I can't resist putting in my 2 cents, so to speak. So every story begins, every chapter, which I kept the chapters short, because I like short chapters.
Yes, that was good.
And every chapter begins with a quote by a famous person.
Yes.
And has a little takeaway message from me. And in the middle is a self-contained story. And so a lot of the self-contained stories are my own, but they're also the stories of people I've been lucky enough to meet along the way. Some very, very interesting people whose stories are worth telling in their own right.
Caroline, were there some favorite chapters for you in this book?
Well, to tell you the truth, I spent the whole weekend reading it.
Yeah, because she only got the book last Friday, and she read the whole thing.
Yeah, I read the whole thing, and I really like the way that you put the quotes in. Of course, that's my thing. I always put a quote at the end of every program, and but that it's so true. I mean, I had a hard time. I was going to use one of them for my ending today. I had a hard time figuring out which one to use, because I also knew someone who grew up in Nigeria, actually, and she wrote a book about her school experiences and how they would beat the children. Mm-hmm. And I thought, how in the world can they justify that? Do you think, Doctor, that affected you adversely in any way?
Well, I definitely wanted to include that story because, on the one hand, it was such a commonplace adversity that nobody even thought about it. Nobody even thought, what a travesty, what a violation, what a violence it was. It was just an accepted part of living in that world, and yet how cruel to do it to a child. And I thought, I would just relate how it was for me. Mm-hmm. And so many people have written and said, I went through that. It was such a violation. It was so awful. I'm so glad you wrote about it. May I just read a little bit from that chapter?
Please do.
Okay. And I'm talking about how I would be learning something that I wasn't supposed to be learning. When I was supposed to be learning one thing, I was busy learning another thing. So it happened in my elementary school, and here again it's happening 6 years later. My emotional brain must have forgotten Mrs. Z and the ruler. By now I was in high school, sitting toward the back of the class and up against the wall. The lowest panes of the tall windows were frosted to prevent students from looking outside instead of attending to the lesson. Our history teacher, Mr. L., was lecturing about something or other, but I found it impossible to pay attention. Instead, I started my Latin homework so that I would have more time to play after school. No one would know, I thought. Since the frosted glass prevented me from seeing out, I figured nobody could see in either. But I had left something out of my calculations. I had not anticipated, although I had heard such stories from older students, that our headmaster would have nothing better to do than to sneak along outside the windows, darting his head up over the frosted panes at random intervals to apprehend such scofflaws as myself. It would have been a strange, even funny sight to an outside observer to see a middle-aged man creeping stealthily alongside the window ledge. But nobody laughed when he popped up and shouted, "Rosenthal, what have you got there?" I held up Caesar's Gallic and Punic Wars, cringing as though it were a copy of Playboy. "Come to my office at once," he barked, waiting for me to exit the classroom, and led the way. Once in the office, he turned to confront me. He was a stooped man, his face lined and etched by years of anger. "You're going to get cuts," he said, not specifying how many. The severity of the punishment was measured by the number of cuts, so named because of the way a cane cuts into flesh. Caning was worse if you didn't know how many, because you weren't able to count on how soon it would be over. There in the corner was his cane, the sort of long switch you might pluck from a tree while on a hike. It was irregular, like a shepherd's staff, the bark peeled off to make it more supple. "Bend over the desk and lift up your jacket," he said. Then across my rear end, whap! Pause. I had never realized before how thin my trousers were. Whap! I'd never been caned before. Whap! The cuts were surprisingly sore, but worse than the pain was the humiliation. Although corporal punishment was commonplace in South African schools at the time, a leftover perhaps of British imperial rule, I remembered my parents calling it barbaric. Somehow that memory comforted me, even though they were nowhere near. I took comfort also in my contempt for the headmaster himself, but he wasn't finished. "I'm surprised at you," he said. "You, of all people. You ought to be ashamed of yourself." It was apparently not enough to physically assault me. He had to compound it by shaming me as well. Once again, the committee in my mind began its chatter. Why should you be surprised? What do you know about me? Should I be surprised at you? No, you are well known to be a barbarian. Yes, sir, I said. You may go now, he said. I left seething both at him and myself. What a coward I had been. I should have told him what I thought of him. Sure, that would have gotten me expelled, but so what? Who wanted to be in a school where such brutality was tolerated, sanctioned, even celebrated? I'll give you 6 of the best, he used to say jokingly, referring to the maximum number of cuts permitted as though talking about some valuable commodity.
That was Dr. Norman Rosenthal reading from a chapter of The Gift of Adversity. You know, that brings back one thing that probably perhaps made it less traumatic for you was the fact that your parents didn't approve. Because I remember as a child, kids who, if they got spanked at school, would get spanked again when they got home.
Mm.
Yeah.
Now that was
really true, you know, the fact that I had their support, and that when I came home, my father was hopping mad and wanted to call the man right away and tell him what a barbarian he was. And I remember my mother restraining him and saying, you know, calm down, calm down.
Well, your father was an attorney, wasn't he?
He was an attorney. And he knew this gentleman, and he did not think well of him.
Mm.
Yeah.
Yes, my father was an attorney, which pops up several times in the course of the book.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of times it seems like the corporal punishment of children, the humiliation part is really a big factor. And what I'm thinking of is when I was in junior high school, I always felt so badly because the boys in shop class had to make paddles that the principal would keep in his office, all the boys' paddles, and if they got in trouble, they'd get paddled with the paddle that they made, a wooden paddle.
Right. So you almost had to make your own instrument of torture.
Exactly.
It's just so...
barbaric.
Barbaric, that's the word, yes.
Well, when I started teaching, I didn't know that they still paddled, okay?
Oh.
And so I inadvertently took this student to the vice principal, as I was told to do by, authorities, because he would not behave in class. And that was his last chance. I had to witness it, and I will never forget that.
Right, that inadvertently you had been a participant.
Yes. Yep. So I never, ever took another student to the vice principal.
You just handled it yourself.
Well, if they misbehaved, they just misbehaved.
But I think an important point is that life consists of big adversities and little adversities.
Yes.
And they're both important.
Mm.
What I say at the beginning of the book is I'm not writing this because, some authors have written all the terrible things that have happened to them, and it's a book of victimhood.
Mm-hmm.
That's not this book at all.
No.
I feel like, yes, I've had my share of adversities, but I've also had more than my share of good fortune. It's a mixture of experiences, but I think that's what most people's lives are like.
Well, also, I was interested in your references to the Holocaust and the death camps, and how some people...
that was very, very interesting, because when I was growing up, the Holocaust felt like it had happened a very long time ago, way, way in the past. Well, I was born in 1950, and the Holocaust finished in 1945.
Yeah.
So it was only 5 years before, and many of us had direct relatives who were killed or suffered terribly in that Holocaust. But somehow, I think it's part of the way we deal with trauma that we try to keep it very far away from us because it's so threatening, and that it's only with time that we can, little bit by little bit by little bit, start allowing the horrors to enter into our consciousness.
Mm-hmm.
For example, I had one in the Lithuanian killings, which was where my family had come from. they had not yet evolved the technology of concentration camps, where they would concentrate people in faraway places so that it wouldn't, quote, upset the locals. But they hadn't developed that technology when they started off in Lithuania, which was one of the early countries for the so-called final solution. So what they did was they took people, Jews and others, from the villages, and they took them into the forest just outside the town, and they made them dig their own shallow graves, and then they shot them, and they were pushed in the graves, and they covered them over, and that was it. And it's very gruesome, and I almost hate mentioning it, but there are eyewitness reports of how the sand was heaving still, because many people had not been fully killed at that point.
Oh my.
But in any event, one of my great uncles had actually killed the guard and a German officer with his bare hands before being taken down himself. And he was always held up as some kind of a hero because he didn't go down quietly.
Mm-hmm.
And, it sounded like a very distant legend, and we even wondered if it was actually true because it sounded too good to be true. Then, years later, a cousin of ours found an eyewitness report. Someone who had extracted himself from the pile of bodies, who had watched this, went back and wrote specifically mentioning our great uncle and how he had died a hero's death. And we were sitting in England. It was a lovely summer day. We were sitting outside a pub, and I was reading this text of this eyewitness report, and I started to cry. And, I'm not a great crier. I rarely cry. But what that really brought home to me is how trauma lodges deep in our psyches. It sits there and is available to be reactivated later down the line. We don't realize the extent to which it's sitting there, exerting its silent influence, and that brought that fact home to me.
I found it interesting that, like you said, it seemed like your whole community was trying to distance the Holocaust, distance itself from the trauma of the Holocaust. And so you never talked about it in school as something that had affected your families. And it wasn't until many years later that you found out.
Exactly. We didn't want to think about it because, firstly, it was too scary.
Yeah.
Secondly, it made us feel weak and vulnerable.
Mm-hmm.
We didn't want to feel that way. And, we sort of felt, let's get on with our lives. That was then and this is now. And I think a lot of trauma victims actually adopt that attitude, which is adaptive to some degree. Let's take, I saw a beauty queen who had been raped. And a beauty queen who had been raped went on to participate in the next round of the show. And that is, on the one hand, you can say, well, that's crazy. She'd just been raped. She should have been sort of getting some kind of help or therapy. But maybe at that point in time, that was her therapy, to show the rapist that she was not completely devastated. I talk about an attack that happened to my mother in the middle of the night. Terrible attack. Miracle that she survived, and she was badly bruised the next day, and they had tickets to the tennis. And she insisted on going to the tennis even though she was badly bruised and looked awful. But at that moment, what helped her was the feeling that these thugs had not taken away from her ability to do what she wanted to do, that she still was an agent of her own life. So I think that, what we were doing there in relation to the Holocaust by getting on with our lives, that's what was what we needed to do at the time. But with the benefit of hindsight, with the feeling of safety that history brings and time brings, we can go back and we can understand it with more depth. And I connected via Facebook with this friend of mine in Australia whose mother had survived death narrowly on 3 occasions in the Holocaust. And we talked on Skype, she and I, and it was all as though the years just dissolved away, and I was talking with my old school friend, and, you know, there was a feeling of warmth and love and connectedness, but we couldn't have done that back then. There were too many inhibitions and too many barriers.
Right. Well, Dr. Rosenthal, when you talk about, you know, the Holocaust, of course, is a whole different level of adversity from most of the stories in your book.
That's
how
correct.
do you you know, but the theme, of course, is the subtitle, the unexpected benefits of life's difficulties, setbacks, and imperfections. Were there unexpected benefits to the Holocaust, or is that?
I think the state of Israel was born out of the Holocaust.
Yes, it
I don't
was.
think that would ever have happened. The nations of the world would not have sanctioned it, I'm sure. So that was something that was born. But I think at the individual level, I had the meeting with the great Viktor Frankl, who was such an unbelievable human being. And he went into the belly of the beast of Auschwitz and the Holocaust, and he came out with a great philosophy and a great way of viewing the world. What he said was that no matter what the situation, there's always some way you can look at it. You've got a choice as to how you view your circumstances. That was something that led to his book, Man's Search for Meaning, that has inspired the lives of millions of people. Now, was the Holocaust worth it for those gifts? Of course not. It was a travesty. It was a tragedy. It was a disaster. And there have been other disasters all over, and there are many. The thing about the Holocaust is the documentation. But I think if these things are not documented, it's easy to forget. Stalin's purges of, tens of millions of people, or Pol Pot, or the Armenian disaster. These things may not have been registered, but Kosovo, may have been in their own ways just as bad. But this was a documented case of millions of people systematically killed by a cultured people with a literature, with a culture, with an opera, with a musical background, and all documented in a way that must make us pause and say, what is this element that we all have to hurt one another, and how can we prevent it from ever happening again?
Well, I found that story about your cousin, the young woman who jumped from the train, and then what you did later when you were confronted by that conductor who was determined to humiliate you and so forth. I thought the way you handled that was quite good.
Well, yes. Luckily, I was older than this young woman was when she, for those who haven't read the book, of course, this is my sister-in-law, my late sister-in-law. She was a fragile woman with a vivid imagination and a sometimes tenuous grip on life, but she was becoming a musician in Europe, and she was crossing the border in a train from Germany to Holland. She'd purchased a lute, and she'd had some kind of really abusive interaction with a German train official that had left her feeling very shaky, so that when she was taken into a compartment in a train to be interviewed alone and left there while the person went apparently to get an interpreter, she panicked and jumped out of the window of a moving train to her death. Something that in retrospect seemed crazy.
Wow.
Years later, I'm traveling on a train myself with my son, and we have Eurail passes, which you have to have endorsed at the point of embarkation, which we didn't know. And so all of a sudden, I'm up against this German train conductor with my son, who is screaming at me and cursing at me and holding the ticket up and sort of flashing it in my face, and I don't even know what he's talking about.
Yeah.
And the most interesting thing is that here were these well-dressed, middle-class people sitting all around, their heads downcast, letting this abuse occur in front of them. So I turned around and I looked at them and I said, aren't you all ashamed of yourselves?
Yeah, right.
An official from your country treat guests in this way, with your history, letting a stranger and a foreigner be, humiliated like this? Can't you do something to help the situation? And they all started to squirm in their seats. And all of a sudden, somebody started talking English, somebody else explained it, another person settled the man down. It turned out that all we had to do was to pay a fine, which the man could have told us in the first place, but he didn't want to tell us. He wanted to show who was boss. He had the uniform, he had the badge, he was the conductor, and he was going to exercise his right to humiliate a foreigner who had violated a rule.
Right.
And so once he had been settled down and the fine had been paid, he was furious. Things had been challenged and his authority had been challenged, and his revenge on us was that when he came around with a pastry cart, he didn't offer us any.
Well, power corrupts. Absolute power corrupts absolutely. And he had absolute power on that train.
That's correct. He had absolute power, or so he thought.
Yeah.
But and the other people, obviously very authority-geared towards letting authorities do whatever they want to do, let the guy hold sway. And so what I did was to somehow do a little intervention there that made them aware that they had some responsibility in this process. And that's a little bit of a mini example. I mean, it's a mini example of authorities who get out of control, and then the people are scared. On this instance, they had nothing to be scared of, but it was so drilled into them to let the authorities have their, sway that was instinct.
Well, right now what's happening in Egypt, with it's unbelievable what's going on.
Absolutely.
And I every day I watch the news and I think, how is this going to be resolved? How can they stop this? They have to stop it, or it's going to end up with everybody being dead. And I don't know.
Well, I think, what it really shows is this brutal streak in human beings is ubiquitous. It's all over. It doesn't belong to one nation. It doesn't belong to one religion. It's part of the human condition that can cause some of the worst adversities that we've ever seen in our lives.
Mm-hmm. Well, you said at one point in one of your quotes that there are, in groups of people, there are good people and there are evil people. It's not all ever one thing.
Well, and in every individual.
In every individual, too.
Evil.
Yeah, that's true.
Yes, well, I think that was Viktor Frankl's, insight, which was really fascinating, that, he was not willing to blame all the Germans for what happened. He said, if you want to be a hero, he said, that's fine, that's your choice, but don't expect other people to be heroes, especially when it's a very, very dangerous time that can get them killed. And really that resonated with me, because in South Africa, we saw injustices being done all the time.
Yeah.
And we knew that if we intervened in any meaningful way, our own lives and our own safety would be on the line. And there's a chapter there showing what happened to a cousin of mine who did in fact intervene and was tortured and put in solitary confinement.
Mm-hmm.
So it's hard to really tell other people how to lead their lives. You know, there are
Yes.
heroes, but they're few and far between. And of course, I've got a section in my book specifically devoted to heroes, some great heroes and some personal heroes, because I think
Yeah.
all of us in our lives have got people that we've looked up to, that we hold up as our heroes, because they really embody some special quality of courage, or maybe it's a parent who goes to work every day in a boring job just to keep their children afloat. Or maybe it's a child with a disability who struggles on bravely every single day, maybe without much complaint, and figures out how to lead a good life with a disability. In my case, it was an uncle who was killed at a very young age in North Africa in the Second World War, and I'm named after him. It was my cousin who was tortured in solitary confinement. It was my mother who used enormous ingenuity and managed to survive. And the quote that I have at the top of that chapter is by Abram Joshua Heschel, who said that just to live is holy and just to be is a blessing.
Mm-hmm.
And just to manage to survive in terrible circumstances is just a blessing in itself.
You're listening to Writers' Voices with Monica and Caroline, and our guest today is Dr. Norman Rosenthal, the author of The Gift of Adversity.
And of course, the things that were going on in South Africa he's talking about is apartheid.
Right.
Yes,
And
indeed.
yeah, and we have somehow forgotten about that, haven't we?
I don't know if it's forgotten, but it's definitely
Put in the back of our consciousness. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm not sure how if that's the case in South Africa. Do you? In fact, maybe you can address that. Is the history of apartheid taught in schools? Is it acknowledged?
It is. I don't know for a fact. I know there's an apartheid museum, and in fact, I'm going there at the end of the year, and I want to, take a special tour of Soweto, which was really pretty much banned for whites. The whites never sort of strayed there, but that was the large black town outside of Johannesburg, and people were segregated, as you know. And I'll be fascinated to see what the country is like currently.
Yes.
But it's been a while.
Now, Nelson Mandela is certainly somebody who converted adversity to great good.
Yes, and I was thinking, how many leaders that applies to, because, of course, Nelson Mandela was imprisoned for 19 years and came out and then, did this enormous job of transforming the country. And I was just thinking of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who was a polio victim, and yet one of our most successful presidents.
Mm-hmm.
I was thinking of Winston Churchill with his terrible depression, how it took somebody who had suffered terrible depressions to take the world when it looked as though Britain had no chance against the German war machine, and just give them the guts and the grit and the inspiration to defeat the Germans. It was amazing. It was absolutely amazing. But in all of these cases, or in many of these cases, we see really the gifts of adversity. So, if you think about it, the message is, okay, you people out there, you've got adversity. There are ways to deal with it. And I sort of outline some of these ways in my book, but there are also lessons to be learned from it. Mm-hmm.
Well, Dr. Rosenthal, as a renowned psychiatrist, what have you found to be the most important tool your patients can use to confront adversity or to extract the gifts of adversity?
I wouldn't say there's just one tool. I would say there are several keys, and I talk about the keys to handling adversity. The first is to analyze your situation. Understand what you're dealing with. And in many of the chapters, you'll see that that is key. Analyzing your situation. Then accepting the reality of the situation. A lot of people live with denial, and that is a very costly defense mechanism. The third thing is to proportion your response. You know, if some co-worker has snubbed you, you don't go in the cafeteria and take your cafeteria tray and throw it at the person. That would not be a proportionate response. So, you know, when you think about something, you proportion your response. But then I think you have to take care of yourself. And I have found why I say transcendence paved my way to the gift of adversity. I have found TM to be an amazing, amazing way for handling adversity. And in the book, I've got a whole chapter called The Gift of Meditation, where I take people who've had tremendous adversity, drug abuse, homelessness, imprisonment, and have turned it around. And they credit TM largely with being able to do that. But in my own personal life, I have seen TM help me at a much more subtle level, in that I had not written a book for 10 years. I had sort of given up on being a writer. And then along came TM, and I started meditating again. And the next thing I had written, Transcendence, and then I revised my classic book, Winter Blues, for its 4th edition. And then, wow, all of a sudden I was able to organize all these stories I've been thinking about for so many years, and that's the gift of adversity. And later on this year, the Winter Blues Handbook will come out. So 3 books and a revision within a 3 or 4 year space of time, thanks to TM, Transcendental Meditation. So adversity doesn't have to be terrible. It can be just not fulfilling your potential. That's an adversity too. And thanks to TM, it's helped me to do that. And of course, there are other important things to settle down one's physiology, including good sleep, eating well, exercising. These are important things. I put them under a chapter called Healthy Habits. Just having a life with healthy habits that gets rid of the unhealthy ones can be terrifically valuable.
What was the quote from Maharishi about holding a grudge? What was that?
Yes, Maharishi spoke about a grudge as fire in the heart.
Yeah.
And I think it's a wonderful image, not only because it burns the heart up, but because it gets you going, it activates you instead of settling you down. It's a beautiful image.
Of course, and holding a grudge never hurts the other person, it only hurts you.
Oh, it can. It can hurt the other person too, but it can also hurt you.
Yeah, well, it always hurts the person holding the grudge.
Well, sometimes the other person doesn't even know about
it.
So obviously, yeah.
Yes, it wears you down. It sits on you. It prevents you from thinking more positively about the world.
Dr. Rosenthal, do you have another chapter you'd like to read today on the air before we run out of time?
Yes, I can read other chapters. Is there a favorite of anybody's? Because I have lots of favorites.
Oh, let's see.
I'll tell you. I'll read to you what to me is the most moving chapter.
Ah, that's perfect.
Because one of my heroes, my personal heroes, you know, we've got these personal heroes I was talking about. One of my personal heroes was my mother. And one adversity, and I'm very aware that I'm talking to a mother and daughter here, and one of the adversities that most of us have to live with is the loss of our parents. And, you know, it's one of those adversities that, in a way, we want to have, because we don't want them to have to lose us first. too painful. So it's the natural order of things, but it's a very difficult thing to come to terms with, and we all have to, unless we're going to carry that grief around forever. And sometimes we lose them slowly, and sometimes we lose them quickly. And here is the chapter which is called It's Never Too Late to Say I Love You. And it starts with a quote by George Eliot, who says, "I like not only to be loved, but also to be told that I am loved. The realm of silence is large enough beyond the grave."
Mm-hmm.
When my mother approached her mid-80s, her heart began to fail. Good medical care kept her going, but medications can do only so much. I visited twice a year, and with each visit saw changes. She'd lost weight, her step had slowed, she was slipping away. My mother had always difficulty expressing emotions, or so she said. "I'm just not emotional," she would declare, "or verbal. Your father is the verbal one." Often when we would talk by phone over the 10,000 miles that separate the U.S. from South Africa, she would run out of things to say about herself, but she had an unusual quality. She'd actually remember what I had said in a previous conversation. She'd follow up when next we talked. "How are the ants?" she'd ask. Or, "Is the smell of paint gone yet?" She'd be asking these questions long after I had forgotten about the exterminator's visit, or that we'd had a room repainted. As she approached the end of her life, her mind became less laser-sharp than it had been, but she was still able to distill things to their essence. We had discussed some years before that when she died, it was unlikely that I would be there with her, given the 10,000 miles. "I know," she said, "but there is always the telephone." A week or so before she died, I remembered her saying that. I was in Vancouver for a professional meeting, and during a walk in the majestic Stanley Park, I found a public phone and called her. "How are you, Mom?" I said. "I'm happy," she said. "I'm happy." It sounded true, although I also wondered whether, even as she lay dying, she sought to comfort me. When she died, one of my sisters and I flew back to Johannesburg, where Mom had lived with my other sister. After the funeral, the prayers, and the visitors, we went looking for her will. She had little by way of money or possessions, but we knew that this was an important step. We wanted to hold on to any last link with her. We found the will, a simple document, dividing everything 3 ways. No surprises there. The surprise came in the form of the following undated letter enclosed with the will and excerpted here. "Dear children, I feel that during my lifetime I haven't told you sufficiently how much I love you. You have been 3 shining lights throughout my life. You have made a mother's pride and joy. And I wish you all a long and healthy life, and have as much pleasure and happiness from your children as I have had from mine." Our grief swept over us like a tidal wave, and we cried our eyes out, but they were good tears, necessary tears. My brother-in-law shut the doors to give us privacy, and we kept crying until we were worn out. My mother's letter sits in a drawer beside my desk, and I read it from time to time. Her words continue to inspire and encourage me to try to do my best and be as kind as I can, both to others and to myself. And the take-home at the end is, it's never too late to say, I love you.
Oh, thank you for sharing that with us, Dr. Rosenthal.
Well, thank you for giving me the opportunity. But to me, this has sat with me because it was a gift that she gave us, and it was a gift that was not of monetary value, and it came out of the adversity of her death. But really, what to me was astonishing about it is that here was somebody, an ordinary person, who was capable of an extraordinary act, and that was to think about the world which was existing after her death. To think about what will the world be like when I'm gone? What will be needed? In this case, it was my children will need me to tell them that I love them. But I think it's a more general issue. What kind of a world do we want to leave to our children when we are gone? What are the things that we need to do now to make sure that even after we are no longer a part of the world, that we have still taken good care of them and good care of it? And so these, I think, are some of the precious gifts that come out of adversity, and that's why I ended it in that way.
Well, Dr. Rosenthal, when does The Gift of Adversity hit the bookshelves, the bookstores?
It's the bookshelves on the 29th of August, but it is available for pre-order, and anybody who wants to get it, I would ask if you could possibly pre-order it. That would be wonderful, because that will all count towards the first week of sales. So I hope you enjoy it. I hope it gives you something, and I hope it's a fun read.
And let's talk, we always like to talk a little bit with our authors about their writing process. And was the writing process for this book different than what you've done before because it was so much more personal?
I think the writing process is inherently difficult. But there again, if you just accept that it's going to be difficult, that already makes it easier. It's when you think it's going to be easy when you really are in trouble. So I think you need to understand that you're going to struggle, that you're going to have to set aside blocks of time when you're freshest and when words come to you most readily. I had two wonderful editors that worked with me. There's nothing like having somebody else look over your stuff, because it's too close to you. You can't really see it that well. You need other people to say, that just doesn't sit right with me. That's better than that. Cut this. Every time my editor would say, cut out that little story, I would think, oh, God, I love that story so much, I can't cut it out. I would run it by two other people, and they would all agree with her. So it's the old advice that Samuel Johnson gave to writers, take that which is most dear to you and strike it.
Yeah, I've heard it expressed as you have to murder your darlings.
Yes, that was William Faulkner, and you do, because you get over-attached to certain things.
Yep.
But that doesn't mean they won't find a place later on in some other...
They might, they could, or maybe they won't. You don't end up with... It's like a chef, Some's going to be leftovers, and some's going to be thrown away, and the best...
Right.
The dinner table, right?
That's right. Now, do you write total on computer completely, or do you do any drafts by hand?
Well, I was traveling in Peru, and one of the most joyful things was writing in a notebook. I purchased a notebook or two in a Peruvian stationer's store, and I was on the Hiram Bingham train going towards Machu Picchu, and writing away and looking out the window and then writing. It was joyful, and then I was sitting in the middle of a breakfast court writing. It was lovely, but for the most part, just because of the convenience of being able to edit, to cut, to shift, I do write on computer.
Well, Dr. Rosenthal, you talk about many different types of adversity in your book and the ways that it has impacted your life. But could you say, can you give like one overarching idea of how adversity has affected you for the better?
I've become a better person. I've become more empathic of other people in their suffering, and I think that's a general rule. I am more likely to be kind and understanding, and less likely to be judgmental.
As a psychiatrist, I think that is a great thing that you've been able to do.
I have noticed often that when I am suffering from something, when life is being difficult, that's often a time when I'm most caring and sensitive to my patients, and other therapists have reported the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, that's very interesting.
Yeah.
You know, suffering deepens my awareness of the pain in other people, and I think that's necessary to be a good therapist.
Yeah, I think you're right.
So these are some of the things, and then of course there's some specific things that I've learned, you know. Don't get into a Ponzi scheme.
Yes. Oh, that was very interesting.
Now, were you tempted to leave that out because it's a little embarrassing that you got involved in that?
I was tempted, but I thought, no. If you're going to really want to help people, then put it in. and it's worth the FBI agent who said to me, you're looking into one window in a house, and you think you know what's going on in the whole house based on what you see through that window, but you could be dead wrong. That was one of the wisest things I ever heard, because that's the same with people.
Mm-hmm.
One side of a story, and you think you know the whole story, but you really don't.
No, there are always two sides to every story, aren't there?
No, there's many more sides than that.
That is true. That is true. Now, you mentioned you have another book coming out this winter?
Yes, it's called the Winter Blues Handbook, and it is a workbook for people who want to be able to work their way through the seasons with help and hope given month by month through the rotating seasons for people who have enjoyed my winter blues and now just want something else that's a little bit more hands-on.
Wonderful.
So that's what that one is.
Well, thank you once again for joining us on Writers' Voices, Dr.
Rosenthal. Thank you for
Rosenthal.
having me, and my best to you both and your listeners.
And Caroline, do you have some last words of wisdom for us?
Yes, this is from Dr. Rosenthal's book, and people should take this to heart. Everybody, success in life depends to a large extent on your ability to collaborate. Although the ability to walk alone is a virtue, interdependence is increasingly necessary in our complex world. Politicians, listen.
Well, thank you for joining us today on Writers' Voices, and see you next week.